Peppa Pig, the Mirror Shadow. The evening was gray and gloomy. Outside, a strong wind howled, making the trees bend and rustle their leaves. There was no rain, but the air felt heavy, as if it could start pouring at any moment. Inside the house, everything was quiet. Peppa sat at the table in the living room, carefully drawing with colored pencils. George was nearby, busy building a tall tower out of blocks. Everything seemed normal. When Mummy Pig called them for dinner, Peppa stood up but accidentally knocked over a pencil. It rolled off the table and disappeared underneath it. She bent down to retrieve it, and then her breath caught in her throat. On the polished wooden floor, she saw a reflection, but it wasn't hers. It didn't move. It just stared back at her from beneath the table, frozen like a photograph. Its little arms were slightly raised, but they didn't match her movements. And its eyes, they were darker than they should have been. Then, slowly, the corners of its mouth curled into a wide, unnatural smile. Peppa gasped and jumped back, her heart pounding. She blinked, and it was gone. Now only her own reflection remained on the floor. Her chest rose and fell quickly. It was just my imagination, she thought, grabbing the pencil with shaking fingers. She rushed out of the room, following George to the kitchen. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. During dinner, as Peppa reached for her spoon, she caught a glimpse of herself in its shiny surface. She was there, the shadow, that same intense stare. This time, the reflection hesitated for just a second too long before mirroring her. Peppa's fingers grew cold, her heart beat faster. She tried to ignore it, until nighttime. When it was time to go to bed, Peppa entered the bathroom. She turned on the light and stepped up to the sink. In the mirror, her familiar room was reflected, but when she raised her little paw, her reflection didn't do the same. Peppa froze. She took a deep breath. Her fingers trembled slightly as she leaned closer. The shadow in the mirror slowly tilted its head. Its eyes were empty. Its expression wasn't hers at all. Peppa took a step back. The mirror fogged up. Dark smudges appeared on the glass, as if someone was breathing on the other side. Peppa's stomach twisted. Then the glass bent inward, as if something was trying to push through. The light flickered. For a second, everything was swallowed by darkness, and when it returned, the mirror was empty. Peppa spun around. No one was there, but she could feel it. Something was standing right behind her. Peppa Pig. Something in the house. The evening at the Pig household was unusually quiet. Peppa and George played in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows. The dim light flickered and a strange tension filled the air. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the trees like eerie whispers in the night. Shadows from the flickering television danced against the walls, elongating into strange, distorted shapes. Then the door creaked open. Peppa turned quickly, her heartbeat quickening. The door had been closed. She was sure of it. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered, but something was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too silent, as if they glided rather than walked. Their eyes were empty, hollow voids, and their smiles were unnaturally wide, frozen in place like grotesque masks. The room grew cold. A chill seeped into Peppa's bones, numbing her fingertips. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, as if the room itself were alive. George clutched his dinosaur tighter, his little fingers trembling. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unseen dread. Daddy Pig's head twisted at an impossible angle, his neck creaking and popping as he turned 180 degrees to stare at them. Mummy Pig's posture shifted unnaturally, her body bending too far forward, her arms dangling lifelessly at her sides like a broken puppet. Then came the sound. A rhythmic click-clack of hooves echoed through the hallways, slow and deliberate. The footsteps did not belong to anyone they knew. Peppa grabbed George's hand, her grip firm, and without hesitation they bolted upstairs. Their feet pounded against the wooden steps, the house groaning beneath them. Peppa reached their bedroom, yanked George inside, and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock with shaking fingers. Silence. The handle began to turn, softly at first, then with more force. Peppa pressed her back against the door, willing it to hold. Then, a slow, deliberate scratching at the wood. It was faint, methodical, like nails dragging just beneath the surface. A breathy whisper followed, an exhale too close, too deliberate. The shadows in the room began to shift, stretching along the walls in odd, angular shapes, pulsing as though the walls themselves were alive. The air grew colder still, wrapping around them like unseen fingers. Peppa felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her breath shallow and rapid. The house no longer felt like home. It had become something else, something dark, something watching, something waiting. And in the suffocating silence, Peppa knew they were not alone. Peppa Pig, Richard, has changed. One day, George invited his best friend, Richard Rabbit, over to play at their house. Peppa didn't mind. She was used to their noisy dinosaur games, even if they sometimes annoyed her. At first, everything was normal. George and Richard ran around with their toys, built towers from blocks, and laughed loudly. But soon, Peppa noticed that Richard started acting strangely. He suddenly went silent and began staring at a single spot on the wall. "Richard, what are you doing?" George asked, stepping closer. "He's there," Richard whispered quietly, not taking his eyes off the wall. Peppa tried to ignore it, but the longer Richard stayed, the stranger his behavior became. He stopped playing altogether and sat in the corner of the room, whispering to himself. When Mummy Pig called everyone for dinner, Richard didn't move. "I don't want to eat," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "He won't let me." "Who's he?" Mummy Pig asked, confused, but Richard just shook his head. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. George was still awake, staring at Richard, who was standing in the middle of the room, gazing out the window. "Richard, go to bed," Peppa said, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, Richard turned around, and Peppa saw that his eyes looked strangely empty, and his smile was stretched and unnatural. "I hear him," Richard whispered. "He tells me what to do." George grew scared and hid behind Peppa. Together they went to get their parents, but when they returned to the room, Richard was gone. "Where's Richard?" George asked, trembling. They searched the house and found him in the living room. He was standing in front of the mirror, but his reflection wasn't moving the same way he was. "I'm not Richard anymore," he said, smiling at his reflection. Daddy Pig and Mummy Pig tried to take Richard home, but he resisted, screaming that he wasn't allowed to leave. When his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit, finally took him away, Peppa's house grew quiet again. But the next morning George started acting strangely. He sat in the corner of the room, whispering to himself while staring at the same spot on the wall where Richard had stared. "Who are you talking to, George?" Peppa asked. "My friend," George replied without looking away. Final scene. Peppa approached George and saw his reflection in the mirror. It was smiling wider than it should have been, and his eyes were just as empty as Richard's had been. A faint whisper echoed in the room. "Now he's my friend." Peppa Pig. George disappeared. George always loved playing in the yard. Every day he ran around the garden with his favorite dinosaur, imagining new adventures. Everything was as usual. Peppa was drawing in her room, Mummy Pig was making lunch, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Through the window, George could be seen running near the big tree. His joyful laughter echoed through the yard. But suddenly, everything fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Peppa looked up. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then she realized George was no longer in sight. The backyard door was slightly open. On the grass lay his toy dinosaur, abandoned in an unnatural position, as if George had simply dropped it. Peppa stepped outside, but the garden was empty. No movement, no sounds, only a gentle breeze. Mummy Pig called for George, but there was no response. Daddy Pig joined the search. They checked behind the bushes, walked around the house, and inspected the fence. But there was no sign of where George could have gone. Half an hour passed. Peppa picked up the dinosaur and noticed strange marks on its plastic back. Narrow, elongated prints that definitely didn't belong to George. The unease grew. They searched the entire yard, the neighboring areas, but it was all in vain. Then Peppa heard a faint sound, a quiet giggle, barely noticeable, coming from behind the bushes. She froze, then slowly walked in that direction. Behind the bushes, no one was there, but the grass was pressed down, as if someone had just been sitting there. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon. The house sank into an eerie silence. The door remained open. On the table, the dinosaur lay still, now cold and forgotten. When darkness fell, Peppa heard the giggle again, this time right by the door. The vanished house. One morning, Peppa and her family woke up in their usual home. Daddy Pig was warming up breakfast, Mummy Pig was making tea, and George was playing with his toys. Everything was calm, but when Peppa decided to step outside, she noticed something strange. Outside the window, there was no familiar green yard, and the sky looked dull and gray. Peppa went to the door and opened it. There was no sound, no people, just darkness. The yard was gone, and the house itself seemed to be surrounded by a dark, endless space. The walls of the house began to slowly disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Peppa tried to return inside, but the door slammed shut, and everything inside turned dark. She screamed and ran back to her parents, but they were sitting as if nothing had happened. Daddy Pig was still reading the newspaper, and Mummy Pig was still making tea. Peppa tried to tell them what had happened outside, but they didn't hear her. Then Peppa noticed that everyone in the house seemed strange. Daddy Pig no longer laughed, and Mummy Pig wasn't smiling. In search of answers, Peppa decided to step outside again. This time, when she stepped out, she found herself in an empty world. Everything around her was gray, with no trees or familiar buildings. Peppa turned around and saw the house she had lived in disappearing, turning into mist. In panic, she rushed back into the house, but now everything inside was as empty and gloomy as it was outside. Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in dark corners, their faces strange and lifeless. Then Peppa realized that her house was gone, and perhaps she was too. There were no traces of her family, nothing familiar. Everything had disappeared.